The laughter started before she even buckled her chin strap. Standing in the cold morning fog of the training field, Specialist Naomi Reyes felt the eyes of the entire platoon settle on her like wet cloth. "Look at the rookie," Sergeant Briggs called out, loud enough for the evaluators to hear. 5'3" of paperwork. Somebody must have checked the wrong box at the recruiting office. A few of the men laughed, the kind of laugh that pretends to be friendly while cutting clean through bone. Another voice chimed in from the back of the formation. "She's too soft for this. Too small. Probably here for the photo op." The leadership evaluation was in 9 minutes. 9 minutes until she would be tested on land navigation, emergency response, and squad coordination, in front of officers who had already heard the rumors about her. They thought they knew her. They thought a quiet woman with steady hands and a soft voice was a mistake the Army would soon correct. They had no idea she had carried wounded teammates out of a collapsed structure 2 summers ago. They had no idea she had buried a brother in uniform before she ever wore one. So tell me something honestly, and leave it in the comments below. Do you believe true strength is loud confidence, or is it silent discipline that refuses to flinch? Naomi did not join the military to escape anything. That part of her story always confused people because they wanted a tragedy, a broken home, a rescue narrative they could nod along to. But the truth was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to explain. She grew up in a small town in eastern Oregon, the kind of place where the sky felt larger than the future, and where her parents ran a small hardware store that smelled like cut wood and motor oil. Her father was a retired Navy corpsman, a man who rarely raised his voice but who taught her how to hold a wrench, how to read a map, and how to listen before speaking. Her mother was a nurse who worked overnight shifts and still made breakfast every morning without complaint. From them, Naomi learned that strength was not something you announced. It was something you proved, slowly, through the way you treated other people when you were tired. The first time she realized people would judge her before knowing her, she was 16. A neighbor had collapsed during a town parade, and Naomi had been the first to reach him, calmly checking his pulse and clearing his airway the way her father had taught her. A man in the crowd, watching her work, muttered that someone should get a real adult. She did not look up. She kept counting compressions. The paramedics later told her she had likely saved the man's life, but the comment stayed with her, not because it hurt, but because it taught her something useful. People would always have an opinion about her capability before they had any evidence of it. She decided, in that quiet way she decided most things, that she would not waste her life arguing with that opinion. She would simply outwork it. When she enlisted at 19, she did not tell her friends because she did not want a goodbye party. She did not want speeches. She wanted to walk into the recruiter's office the same way she walked into everything else, with a clear head and a steady pulse. She wanted to serve because she believed, simply and without drama, that some people had to be willing to stand between others and harm. She did not believe she was special. She believed she was responsible. That distinction, small as it sounded, would later carry her through nights when louder soldiers folded. Basic training did not surprise her the way it surprised others. The yelling did not rattle her, because she had spent her childhood listening for the quiet things between louder ones. What did challenge her were the standards, the unrelenting precision of them, the way a single uneven seam on a bunk could undo an entire morning. She made mistakes, plenty of them, and she did not pretend otherwise. On her second week, she misjudged a rope climb and slid down hard enough to burn the inside of her palms raw. A drill sergeant stood over her and asked, without sympathy, if she planned to quit before lunch or after. She looked up, blood on her hands, and said, "After, drill sergeant." He did not smile, but something in his jaw shifted, just slightly, and he walked away without another word. The days bled into each other. She learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, then 3, then whatever fragments she could steal between formations. She learned that exhaustion was not an excuse, it was a condition, and that her job was to operate inside that condition without becoming sloppy or cruel. She watched other recruits crack in different ways. Some of them got loud, picking fights to prove they still had fire left. Some of them got quiet in a darker way, the kind of quiet that meant they were calculating how to disappear. Naomi found a third path, one her father had described to her once without naming it. She let the pressure pass through her instead of pushing back against it. When a sergeant told her she ran like a civilian, She did not argue. She came back the next morning and ran the route twice before formation. When a peer told her she would never pass the combatives qualification because she was too small, she did not glare or snap. She studied the leverage techniques in the manual every night for 2 weeks, drilled them with anyone who would partner with her, and passed the qualification without ceremony. She refused to become bitter, even when bitterness would have been understandable. She watched other women in her platoon harden into something brittle, learning to mirror the cruelty around them in order to survive it. And she made a quiet decision that she would not pay that price. She believed bitterness was a slow infection, and she had seen what infections could do to a body in her mother's nursing textbooks. She corrected her mistakes without flinching, accepted criticism without flinching, and kept moving. By the end of basic, she was not the fastest, not the strongest, and not the loudest. But she was the one the drill sergeants pointed to when a new recruit needed to be paired with someone steady. That, she would later understand, was its own kind of recognition, even if no one called it that out loud. She graduated, pinned her insignia carefully, and called her mother from a payphone outside the barracks. She did not cry. She just said, "I made it, Mom. I'm still me." Her unit assignment took her to a base in the high desert, where the wind never seemed to settle and the sun bleached the color out of everything by noon. She was assigned to a transportation and logistics company that supported field training operations, which meant long convoys, longer planning meetings, and the constant grind of moving people and equipment across unforgiving terrain. The mocking that had started in basic did not disappear. It only learned to wear quieter clothes. In her first month, she noticed the pattern. When the platoon gathered to plan a route, her input was overlooked, even when she had been the one assigned to study the maps the night before. When a drill called for someone to take point on radio communication, her name was skipped twice in a row, despite her certification scores being among the highest in the company. When trucks needed pre-mission inspections, she was given the easier vehicles, as if her hands were not trusted with the harder ones. None of it was loud. None of it would have shown up on a complaint form. It was the kind of quiet exclusion that a person could only feel, not prove. Sergeant Briggs, the same one who had called her a rookie that foggy morning, was the worst of it, but not in the way people expected. He never insulted her directly after that first incident. He simply stopped seeing her. He would address questions to the soldiers standing next to her, even when she was the subject matter expert. He would assign her tasks that were below her training level, not as punishment, but as a way of suggesting that anything more would be a risk. She understood what he was doing, because she had seen men like him before, in her hometown, in church basements, in hardware stores. He did not hate her. He simply did not believe in her, and he believed his disbelief was a form of professional caution. She did not confront him. She had watched other soldiers try that approach, marching into a sergeant's office to demand respect, and she had seen how rarely it worked. Demanding respect, she had learned, was like demanding silence from a storm. It only made you sound smaller. So she did something else. She studied. Every night, after the lights in the barracks dimmed, she pulled out her field manuals and read them by the small lamp clipped to her bunk. She memorized convoy protocols, casualty evacuation procedures, frequency hopping patterns, and the exact load weights for every vehicle in the motor pool. She practiced not work until her fingers moved without her thinking. She volunteered for the worst shifts, the ones nobody else wanted, and she used them to learn the equipment she had not been trusted with during the day. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did not need an audience. She was building something inside herself that did not require witnesses, and she trusted, the way her father had taught her to trust, that the moment for it would arrive on its own schedule. The moment arrived on a Tuesday in late October, during a multi-company field exercise meant to simulate a humanitarian response after a natural disaster. The scenario was complex by design. A simulated earthquake had supposedly struck a remote region, and the units were tasked with establishing communication, navigating to displaced civilians, providing first aid, and coordinating extraction routes across difficult terrain. Halfway through the exercise, the simulation became real. A genuine flash storm rolled in over the ridge, faster than the meteorological briefing had predicted. And within 20 minutes the dry creek beds had turned into running water, and the radio relays had started cutting out. 2 of the lead vehicles in Naomi's convoy lost contact with the command post. A soldier from another platoon, a young private named Hollis, slipped on a wet embankment while trying to secure equipment and went down hard, opening a gash along his forearm and likely fracturing his ankle. The senior medic was 3 kilometers away with another element. Sergeant Briggs, who had been leading the forward team, was suddenly facing a situation that did not match the script. His radio was static. His map was wet. His injured soldier was bleeding through his sleeve. Naomi did not wait to be asked. She moved to Hollis first, kneeling in the mud beside him and applying direct pressure to the wound with a clean field dressing she had pulled from her own kit. Not the standard issue one, but the supplemental one she had been quietly carrying for months. She spoke to him in a low, even voice, asking him his name, his unit, what he had eaten for breakfast. The small grounding questions that her mother had taught her would keep a frightened person's heart rate from climbing. While she stabilized his arm, she called out clearly, without panic, to the soldier nearest her, naming him by his last name, telling him to bring the splint kit from the second truck and to check Hollis's ankle for swelling. She turned her head toward Briggs and said, again without raising her voice, that the relay on the western ridge was likely the one failing, and that if he repositioned the antenna 200 meters east, toward the rock outcrop they had passed 20 minutes earlier, they would likely regain contact with command. Briggs stared at her for a moment, the rain running off the brim of his cover, and then he nodded once and moved. She did not feel triumphant. She felt focused, the way a person feels when there is no room left in the body for anything except the next correct action. She finished dressing Hollis's wound, immobilized his ankle, and helped 2 other soldiers carry him onto a litter. She coordinated the new route to the extraction point using the topographical landmarks she had memorized from weeks of studying maps no one had asked her to study. When command finally came back over the radio, it was Briggs who reported the situation, but it was her voice in the background, calm and exact, providing him the grid coordinates. Hollis would later say, from a hospital bed in town, that he did not remember much from that afternoon, but he remembered her voice and how it had sounded like someone who was not afraid. In the days that followed, nobody made a speech about Naomi. There was no ceremony, no medal pinned to her chest, no sudden parade of apologies from the soldiers who had doubted her. The military did not work that way, and frankly, neither did she. What happened instead was smaller, slower, and more honest. The morning after the exercise, when the company gathered for accountability formation, Sergeant Briggs walked past her without speaking, the way he always had. But when the planning meeting started an hour later, and the lieutenant asked who had the clearest red on the western communication corridor, Briggs cleared his throat and said, without quite looking at her, "Reyes does." It was not an apology. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a redirection of trust, the first one she had received from him, and she accepted it the same way she accepted everything else, with a small nod and no commentary. Over the following weeks, the pattern shifted in ways that only she could fully measure. She was assigned to harder vehicles. She was included in the planning sessions she had previously been left out of. When a new soldier rotated into the unit, the squad leader paired them with her for orientation, the same way the drill sergeants in basic had once done. She did not gloat. She did not remind anyone of what she had done in the storm. She simply continued to do her job, the way she had always done it, with the same quiet precision she had brought to a hardware store counter at 15 years old. What surprised her most was that she found herself protecting the very people who had doubted her. When a younger soldier in the platoon, a private named Coltrane, made a navigation error during a follow-up exercise that could have embarrassed him in front of the lieutenant, she quietly redirected his map work before the mistake became visible, saving him a correction he did not need. When a peer from another squad complained loudly about Briggs's leadership in the chow hall, Naomi listened without joining in, and then said, simply, that Briggs had moved fast in the storm and that mattered. She did not say it to defend him. She said it because it was true, and because she had decided, long ago, that her version of strength would not include rewriting other people's worst moments into permanent labels. She had been mocked, and she had survived it, and she did not want to become someone who handed that same experience down to the next person in line. She thought, sometimes at night when the barracks were quiet, about what her father had told her once, sitting on the back porch of their hardware store. He had said that the world was full of people who confused volume with strength, and that the soldiers he remembered most from his own years in the Navy were not the loud ones. They were the ones who stayed steady when the floor moved. She understood now what he had meant. She had become one of them, not because she had set out to, but because she had refused, day after day, to become anything less. Respect arrived the way her father had told her it would, on its own schedule, without announcement. There was no single moment when Naomi could say she had earned it, no clean line in the sand between before and after. There was only the slow accumulation of small things. A senior NCO who once would have skipped her name now pulled her aside to ask her opinion on a route plan. A junior soldier who had once laughed at the back of the formation now stood a little straighter when she walked past, not out of fear, but out of the kind of attention that comes when someone realizes they have been wrong about a person and is trying, quietly, to correct the record. Even Sergeant Briggs, who never quite became warm with her, began addressing her by her last name with a particular evenness in his voice. The way men of his generation spoke to soldiers they had decided were real. She did not need more than that. She had not joined the army to be loved. She had joined to be useful, and usefulness, she now understood, was its own form of belonging. She thought often, during those months, about what military honor really meant. She had grown up hearing the word the way most people did, attached to flags and parades and recruiting posters, but she had come to believe it was a much smaller and more daily thing than that. Honor, she decided, was what a soldier did when no one was watching, and what a soldier refused to do when everyone was. It was the choice not to humiliate the people who had once humiliated you. It was the discipline to become stronger than the judgment you had been handed, without using that strength to deliver judgment back. She did not think of the men who had called her soft as enemies. She did not even think of them as obstacles. She thought of them as part of the terrain she had learned to operate inside, the same way a soldier learns to operate inside heat, or cold, or rain, or fog. They had not broken her. They had, in a strange way she would not have admitted out loud, helped shape her by forcing her to become so consistent in her own values that no outside opinion could shift them. When younger women in her unit came to her later, frustrated and tired, asking her how she had handled the doubt, she did not give them a slogan. She told them the truth, which was that she had simply kept going. She had kept reading the manuals. She had kept showing up early. She had kept her voice low and her standards high. She had kept refusing to become bitter, because bitterness, she had decided, was a luxury soldiers like her could not afford. And she had kept believing, even on the hardest days, that the work itself was the answer. Not the recognition, not the rank, not the eventual nod from a sergeant in a planning meeting. The work, the quiet, repeated, unglamorous work of becoming someone the mission could rely on. That, she had come to understand, was what the uniform actually asked of her. Everything else was decoration. Specialist Naomi Reyes never became famous on her base. Her name did not get attached to a viral story, and her photograph did not end up on a recruiting brochure. What happened to her was both smaller and larger than that. She became, over the course of a few years, the kind of soldier other soldiers quietly hoped to be paired with on a hard day. She became the steady hand in the corner of the planning room. She became the voice on the other end of the radio that did not waver when the weather turned. She became, in the most ordinary and most extraordinary sense, a soldier. The mocking that had greeted her on that foggy morning did not break her. It refined her. It stripped away the parts of her that wanted approval, the parts of her that might have been tempted to perform her competence rather than simply live it. And it left behind something harder and quieter and more useful. She did not need the men who had laughed at her to apologize. She did not need the world to acknowledge what she had survived. She needed only to keep showing up, with clean boots, a steady pulse, and a willingness to do the next correct thing. If there is a message worth carrying away from her story, it is this. Military women do not need permission to be strong. They do not need a sergeant's blessing, a peer's approval, or a stranger's belief in them to become who they already are. Strength, the real kind, the kind that holds when the floor moves, was never something that could be granted from the outside. It was something built quietly, in the dark, by women who refused to be defined by the laughter of people who had no idea what they had already survived. Naomi was one of them. There are more of her than the world knows.